Welcome to Living in the 21st Century. Joining me today is Larry Jagan from all the way in London. He is a veteran journalist who have covered world stories. Larry, it's a pleasure having you here on Living in the 21st Century. And I would love you to tell me a little bit more about yourself.
Oh, well, I've been covering Asia perhaps for the last 40 years. Part of that time I was at the BBC, and since 2000 I've been a freelance journalist based in Bangkok and Yangon. Currently, of course, I'm back in London, but I follow events very closely, particularly in Myanmar. The events of 1988 was what drew me to look at what was going on in Myanmar, although in those days we used to call it Burma, very closely. And since then, I've really followed everything in minute detail. Originally, in the 70s, I was a China specialist, and they followed developments during the Cultural Revolution, which has led me to be very interested in the role that China actually plays in Southeast Asia. And it's changed over the last 40, 50 years. It's now become much more central to the developments of the region. So essentially, I'm a political and economic correspondent.
That's beautiful. I guess there's a whole lot of stories we would love to touch this morning, but obviously it would be difficult. But I want to ask this question. What really caused the current crisis in Myanmar?
That's really a very difficult question to answer, and to answer simply. The situation in Myanmar, or Burma, has been festering since independence. In fact, even before independence, during the 40s. And there's been a lot of unresolved issues. One of the key issues is the role of the army. The army was the one that in those days it was a rebel army trained by the Japanese. They were the ones that really liberated Myanmar. They were the ones who introduced a constitution that was going to bring about democracy and promised some kind of federal state, because Myanmar is really also a very diverse country. There are well over 100 different ethnic groups, perhaps 20 or 30 that are the main ones. And these unresolved issues of the military controlling the country and the need to find a role and place for the ethnic groups who are mainly around the border has not been resolved. The political changes in the 50s and the 60s really didn't do very much to find a new state or nation. It was still very much a colonial country, because after all, Britain had colonized it before then. In 1988, we had student protests. At the time, the view or the followings for more democracy, particularly in Southeast Asia, also inspired the student movement in Myanmar. Since then, we've had a military dictatorship until 2010, when a quasi form of democracy was introduced. In 2015, the National League for Democracy, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, overwhelmingly won the elections, which was a shock to the military. But they decided that they would allow the NLD of Aung San Suu Kyi to rule and see what kind of job they would do. Now, there's little doubt that the tensions between the military and the civilian government increased during the period of Aung San Suu Kyi's first administration. Then we had the elections in November 2020, which the NLD won overwhelmingly, 83% of the vote. This is similar to what had happened in 2015, so it was really no surprise. But the military were not happy about seeing another 5 years of a civilian leader who they felt distrusted the military and wanted to get them back into the barracks. Because even under the elections of both 2015 and 2020, the military still has a major political role. They control 25% of the seats in the parliament, and they control three key ministries. And there was little doubt that after the second massive electoral victory of the NLD, they were going to try and ensure that Myanmar has a proper, genuine democratic future. And that was what the military couldn't countenance.
Yes, for what little bit I've read, I recognize that presently Myanmar is going through a humanitarian crisis. What are some of the humanitarian challenges you think Myanmar may very well face today?
Well, unfortunately, one cannot divide the humanitarian crisis in Myanmar and humanitarian problems in Myanmar from the coup. Everything changed on the 1st of February when the military seized power and unleashed really a war against civilians, which has really divided the country even further. The 10 years of transitional democracy, first 5 years under a semi-military government, and then 5 years under Aung San Suu Kyi's NLD, we saw the standard of living improve. We saw the economy develop, because before 2010, Myanmar was essentially isolated internationally. There was some trade and some aid from particularly China and the rest of Asia, but essentially was isolated, and the West obviously had sanctions against them. That has changed, and we've seen the country beginning to develop. We've seen much more inclusiveness in the rural areas. That has all been stopped by the military regime. Of course, a year ago, as in most countries, COVID also hit Myanmar, and the kinds of things that we've seen in other, particularly developing countries, also were prevalent in Myanmar. So the economic growth was halted initially by COVID, and now has been really exacerbated by the military. And what we see is the possibility of real starvation coming to Myanmar in the next few months. June is the planting season. Essentially, Myanmar is a rice-dependent country, and if the rice is not planted in June and reaped later in the year, then there is going to be real problems of starvation. We understand at the moment fertilizer is too expensive. There aren't bank loans because the country has been brought to a standstill by the civilian, particularly the young people's reaction to the coup in trying to prevent them really running the country. So we are going to see increasing problems of hunger in the next 6 months. Most of the factories are not working. So, even in the urban areas, workers are not getting their salaries. So they're going to be dependent on handouts and food for work programs, which are unlikely to take place because those countries that normally would be donating these kinds of programs, particularly in the West, will have put an embargo on it. Then we have the real problem, the COVID explosion. At the moment, there is no testing going on in Myanmar. Some vaccinations are being done, particularly of the military and the Buddhist monks. We have no idea how bad the COVID is. We are not seeing the kinds of deaths that we have seen in the last 3 months in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, which are neighboring Myanmar. So the COVID explosion, I think, is really going to just worsen the situation, one where there is already probably a real danger of starvation.
Wow, I can imagine. I noticed that over the years that the United States government and Myanmar hardly had any strong relationships based on its political atmosphere. Do you see the United States at present can play a pivotal role in some form of restoration to that government?
I'm afraid I don't think there is much role for the US directly in finding mediation or resolving the political conflict in Myanmar. Yes, the Americans have been very strongly behind the democracy movement since 1988. During the 90s and the early 2000s, there was American embargoes. There's very limited American investment in Myanmar. That began to change after 2010 with a sort of military civilian government, but it's still very small. The problem is that the Myanmar military now in control will not listen to the US. They see them as really out to get regime change. And the only country that will have an influence in Myanmar, or main influence, is China. And China has a certain ambivalent attitude. So if the US is to play a role, it will have to be in relation to discussions and perhaps influence that they might have on Beijing towards Myanmar.
Okay. Turning a little bit from Myanmar to China, over the years, the U.S. has consistently stated that China, basically an imperialistic kind of nation, was engaged in uneven and unequal foreign trade. There seems to be trying to dominate the world in terms of trade, and apparently, to some degree, they may very well be doing that. Do you see the unfair trading action by course has an impact on how US and China may perceive going forward in this 21st century?
Oh, I have no doubt that as far as Asia is concerned, the conflict relationship between Washington and Beijing is absolutely critical. It is the most important relationship in terms of determining what happens. Certainly in terms of trade. There's no doubt that China sees itself as the country that is still to catch up with the US in terms of economic dominance, but is intent on doing it. There's no doubt that China is also using its incredible wealth to try and if you like, dominate trade and investment, particularly in Southeast Asia, and particularly Myanmar. That is going to be the big issue during the coming 4 years of the Biden administration. The Chinese, in some ways, were very angry at Donald Trump, whose vindictiveness and war cries against Beijing made them angry. But in reality, they were quite happy because the Chinese withdrawal, the American withdrawal from Southeast Asia gave them an added advantage. Now Biden wants to have a more positive bilateral relationship with Beijing, wants to have multilateral relationships with the region in particular, and it looks as though Asia is one of his high priorities with the Japanese and South Korean visitors this week. So I think it is going to be pivotal. At this stage, it's very difficult to predict whether it's going to be aggressive, fragile, well, it'll be fragile anyway, but to what extent it's going to be a peaceful relationship, hard to tell.
Okay, so in your opinion, you think that there is a significant difference in the Biden's administration and the former Trump administration and how they perceive the course of action in restoring a fair trade balance between China and US go forward?
From the outside, sitting here in London and in Bangkok, that's what it looks like. The sort of nationalism, the acute nationalism that we saw or we interpreted from afar in the Trump administration is quite different to what we're seeing from the Biden administration. I think the administration is looking for fair trade, not simply free trade, but that's an understanding that actually it takes two countries to come up with reasonable fair trade solutions. Whereas the perception I have certainly of Trump was it was tit for tat tariffs, vindictive increase in tariffs. That is not something that's going to encourage Beijing to look at ways of making concessions. I think there is a great opportunity for the Biden administration to improve economic relations with Asia as a whole, but particularly Beijing. But it has to be one where it's seen as a partnership rather than as a rivalry.
Beautiful. I love what you just mentioned there, free trade and fair trade. In early 2000s, free trade had allowed a lot of American manufacturers to go abroad and other foreign countries where wages and salaries were much lower to set up shop and do their manufacturing and production and so forth, which obviously had hindered most Americans here from getting jobs because hundreds and thousands of jobs then were exported to these countries. Fair trade, so in one way it did help American businessmen and corporations. Fair trade is that despite this happen, you still have American people involved in what China was doing because some people went to China and set their businesses up and doing the same stuff. America, a capitalist, when you look at it from that standpoint, what difference did it really make, in your opinion, that in one breath you have fair trade free trade helping everyone, including Americans and those abroad, fair trade, America wanted that China maintain a certain level of level trade playing ground for everyone. Could you have it both ways?
Well, I think one focuses on a number of issues when one looks at trade. We're not just talking about manufacturing commodities or for instance, there's no doubt that there was a transfer, not just from America, but from Australia and Britain, manufacturing plants to China because of the incentives, particularly of lower salaries, lower wages, less industrial action, and so on and so forth. But there is a difference in terms of the economic development of China and America, for instance. China remains essentially an agricultural country, and therefore will have much more a bias towards agriculture and manufacturing that builds on the agricultural base. Whereas in the United States, it's a much more sophisticated economy, much more technologically driven, banking, financial sector. The Chinese have always been very keen to invest in the US, and I think that there could be. I'm not a trade specialist, but there could be payoffs one way or the other. But I think that some people really forget that there is tremendous amount of American investment in China, where a lot of American goods are actually sold in China. Starbucks is one of the most popular cafes in throughout China. As long as there is negotiation and discussion about or give and take, I think there is potential. Of course, there will always be friction. No one's going to get everything they want, but I think there is room for some kind of negotiations, and we're moving into that era now with China leading particularly in Asia, setting up the Asia-Pacific zone, the East Asian Economic Community, where they want to reduce tariffs of imported goods and obviously exported goods. So I think things are going to be very different in the coming years, particularly during the Biden administration. But of course, the one thing that still is going to overshadow everything is the COVID recovery.
Yes. Talking about the COVID recovery, we recognize it came down tremendously here in the US, and everything seems to be going back to a form of restoration to what it was previously at. They are back in England. I'm not sure how it's going there, but with not having Englishmen traveling to the US and so forth, do you see that having a major impact on the tourist industry as we move forward, or what is your opinion on that?
Well, I think the one thing to stress at this stage is that in terms of vaccinations, which obviously is going to be one of the key to countries returning to some form of new normality. The developed countries, the US, Europe, Britain, are much better off. Over 50% of the population has been vaccinated or in the process of being vaccinated. That's not the case in lots of other countries in Asia, particularly in Africa, and to some extent Latin America. So that's going to be crucial if we're to see tourism and travel return to something like what we experienced in the past. Of course, the first sort of travel will be intra-regional. We'll see Americans traveling within the American continent, Britons and Europeans traveling within Europe. At the moment, that's very limited, and they're looking at possibilities of making it easier with what they call the vaccination passports. But I do feel that we are going to see increased travel, certainly by the end of the year. I suspect in the last quarter of this year, it's going to start to increase again. But of course, it's going to be limited not so much because of accessibility or desirability, but by costs. Air travel is going to be much more expensive, particularly as airlines are trying to recuperate on their losses over the last 12 months. Many airlines, like the Thai International, are looking at restructuring programs. So until that is resolved, we are going to see costs skyrocket, and that is going to limit travel.
Yes, and one more question I want to really touch on, and this is India. We recognize that India had actually given out all their vaccines to several different nations, and now the virus is taking its toll on India, and it's just enormous, the amount of lives that are dying daily in India. What do you see this spells with India? How do you think the Indian government should, at this point? I know I'm asking you a question I shouldn't probably be asking you, but is there any advice right now you think you can actually think that would be worthwhile for the Indian government considering this impact?
The situation in India is heartbreaking. There's no question about that. It's horrendous. I have to say that we focus on India partly because the new variant from the subcontinent has been identified as the Indian variant, but also because we have better relations with India. It's more prominent, it's larger. But the same level of COVID is in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Nepal, and in Sri Lanka. It is getting out of hand. The government was unprepared the Indian government in particular was unprepared. We have more of an understanding of what's happening in India because India is much more transparent than the other countries in the subcontinent. There's more testing going on, and there is more reporting of the deaths and the horrendous situation of funeral pyres in playgrounds and bus stops and so on. The government, of course, was rather complacent earlier this year, and in a way, it allowed very large, famous religious ceremonies to take place where people were packed together. They've had elections, regional elections, in the last 4 months, and they've allowed massive political rallies. So it was something that was almost inevitable. Unfortunately, India was just and is not at this stage able to cope with the demand on even things like oxygen, protective equipment, the drugs that they need for those that are already suffering from COVID. Of course, they had an opportunity earlier this year to vaccinate their population. It's something like only 3% of the Indian population have been vaccinated. They're trying to speed that up because, again, that's something that might help put a hold on the spread of COVID. It's in the government's hands without a doubt, and it's very difficult to know just to what extent they're going to be successful. I have to say that there is a qualification, there is an impediment, there is an obstacle. India is a federal country. It's a federal state. And so each of the states have their own authorities. And it's not something that the national government can say, this is what should happen, this is what's going to happen. And we've had problems transporting oxygen cylinders from one state to another because of bureaucracy. There is also bureaucratic problems with the importing of equipment that's been needed for distribution in India. So the government needs to really get a handle on it.
Okay. Well, Larry, we have come to the end of our program. So much education compounded into 28 minutes. But I'll tell you what, I would give you a call pretty soon. I hooked up on WhatsApp, so definitely we're going to reach out and talk to each other because there's some things I would love to discuss with you pretty soon. But until then, for all those who have been tuning in, I want to thank you for joining us on Living in the 21st Century. Take good care. Have a good day.